Hi, everybody. I'm Jen Dennis, and I'm here with my partner in crime.
Lisa Milbrand.
And this is an episode of Don't Panic. It's going to be a little different from our standard episode. I think because our goal here is to set the table a little bit for what we're trying to do with the channel and how we think about the topics that we think about. So, Lisa, I wanted to start by just kind of asking you, because this was your brainchild, when you thought about bringing service journalism to people, what were you thinking that we would show people?
A little bit about how we go about researching, how we find experts, how we approach giving people good advice, and the basis that we have behind it. So it's not just that we're making stuff up or anything like that, because there's a there's a lot of that going around where people make things up, and we do talk to experts, we do look for sources. And Jen and I both have over the years gotten all kinds of arcane bits of information that we become experts on as a result of different projects we've worked on.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons I was excited about this topic actually was because we're not going to cover everything. There's no way to cover everything we want to cover in a quick fashion. So if we can help people understand how we think about subjects, I think they can do the groundwork if they're in a situation where they want to become essentially an overnight expert on a topic because they're facing something that requires urgent expertise in their lives.
Right, right. And there's the old saw of like do your own research being a bad thing, but there is a way to do it and do it correctly. And you and I have done that for 30 years or so.
I
So
love I love to joke with people too, especially because there's been times in my life where I was required to become an expert on industrial scrubbers overnight for a client, and that is a totally different world than, 5 trends in florals for
weddings,
the
yeah.
wedding. So I think that's really interesting, but there is a framework that works for all of them. And I know we talked about this a little. One of the things that I think is really important is there are experts out there on the internet, and not everybody you come across is an expert. So I guess the first thing I want to talk about is, how do you like to think about authority? When you go to a website and you are determining, are these people I can trust or not? What's the first thing you're looking for, like the basis?
Well, as we talked about, it depends on what how important the topic is. If it's something like you want health advice about a condition you have, like we talked about. I'm a transplant patient, and so I'm immunocompromised, which is part of my germaphobe thing. And so, if I'm looking for advice about kidney transplant or immunocompromised, I'm not necessarily going to my dermatologist for that. I would want someone who has expertise in that particular topic.
Right. And back on that dermatologist topic, what I thought of was, think of it as someone who has skin in the game, someone who has invested time in getting expertise. Another thing about skin in the game is, and this is a rubric I use a lot, is, can this person get sued if they're wrong? I think that's another really good way to look at a resource and ask yourself, if someone who is purporting to have a medical license is giving you information, their license is at stake if they're giving you bad information. So that can be a good foundational piece for establishing authority.
Or like you said, if if it's a company that's selling you a beauty product, for instance, and says it's going to do something, it has to be able to prove it. And if it
Provided
doesn't,
it's in the US and subject to US laws.
exactly. So, and we've worked on those sorts of projects before as well. So, and it's very strict, and usually there are lawyers involved in any sort of claims that a legit beauty product would offer on their website.
Yeah, so I like that, you start with someone who has a right to talk, who knows what they're talking about, and has the right to talk about it. And I think the other piece you said is it's specific knowledge. This idea of a transplant doctor versus a dermatologist. Both are doctors, both are facing certain risk if they're wrong. But obviously, it usually the doctor who specializes in something is going to be the doctor who has the specialized knowledge in that thing.
Right. And, I mean, I would think it might be a little harder to claim malpractice against a dermatologist for giving you transplant advice versus, the actual transplant doctor. So,
A really good point. So there's investment in knowledge and some sort of proof. There's this secondary layer of specific information. And then once you've established someone as an authority, I think the next level is to understand what their point of view is. And I think there's another level of rigor that you bring to what the expertise that they're promising you or what the point of view they're sharing is. Do you want to talk a little bit? I don't want people to get lost in the weeds, but about studies and
oh, yeah.
how research and conclusions drawn from research should be evaluated.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite things because I do, some health reporting. So, a lot of times when you look at a study, first you want to kind of, I look at them myself. A lot of people don't. Look and see what the study size is, see how many people they include. If a lot of times it's based on mouse studies, which, obviously has its own problems, because while they can be relatable, sometimes they're not the same. But then also, but if I do cover a study, I do like to talk to the study author, but I also like to talk to someone else who's an expert in the field, but was not related to the study, because sometimes it's interesting. And, they'll say, oh, this, study's not great because XYZ, there weren't a lot of people, like, you shouldn't necessarily take this advice. So even studies sometimes can be, not it's hard to have a perfect study, but I mean, it's hard to be perfect about anything, but some studies are better and more um, carry more weight than others.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because we had a conversation about quality of studies that can be about the sample size or who you're studying or how you form the question or all of these different elements of the study. It also made me realize that there's a non-study analog to this, which is it's the difference between saying Joe Schmo said X and people are saying X. That specificity there is a big deal. And so I think one of the things that I always look for is how detailed and concrete, how pin downable is every piece of what people are saying to me in terms of I can take this piece to someone else and ask if it's right or not.
Well,
And I think a lot of people sneak stuff in through generalizations.
the interesting thing, and I want to like separate that out too, because I see so many people who are like, if it's a anonymous source, it's made up, or it's not a real thing. And as someone, I in my service journalism, there's not really a cause for anonymous sources. I
An
don't
anonymous source about some dermatology study, but maybe, who knows?
we don't really deal with that, but we do have friends and loved ones who are in that aspect of journalism. So one thing that they it's not like they just take the author's word for it or the reporter's word for it, because then you get into a situation like the movie Shattered Glass, where the person made up sources, and it was so rare that it became a movie. So, what people do in an unnamed source story is, the editors, and generally at that point there are lawyers involved, are you know, find out the source, but it's kept very, like, journalists go to jail for withholding who the source is. So it's a serious thing. And they do check the source. They usually try and corroborate the information, and are usually able to, from a secondary source or someone else. So unnamed sources or anonymous sources are still known to the person who is writing about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a complexity there though, because it's pretty easy to stand up a website that looks like a news website that isn't a news website. So I'm leery of giving a general advice about, so it leans on the same authority as the doctor piece. Look at the publication and ask yourself, if they have authority. Are they going to lose reputation? Are they going to get sued? If you haven't heard of someone before, it's probably better to watch them for a while as a publication. I don't want to say all new publications are bad or do things incorrectly, because they don't.
Because we're in
But Yeah, exactly. But I do think if you don't have a sense of who that publication is, that's the same. It sort of comes in at the same level of I trust you as much as I trust a non-dermatologist about dermatology issues, right? Until I know and you build that authority with me, it's just a different kind of authority.
Right, it's like rando on TikTok.
Yeah. I mean, that's a kind of funny because I used to think that long articles could sneak a lot of stuff in because you just get tired reading. If something is 5,000 words, around 2,500, you start to be like, whatever, whatever, yeah, yeah, yeah. And that used to be how people snuck things in. But now we have these tiny, um, quick hit content where you can actually be given the whatever because it's set to a cute song or has a puppy in it or whatever. So now I can't even say longer stories, or you have to read longer stories more carefully than shorter ones.
Well, and I think, in our write up for this, I'll include there's a link to a great site that if you are not sure about whether the source is a legitimate source, if as far as media publications or media websites, you can check it out on there and you can see, first of all, if it's biased one way or another, but you can also see how strongly they fact check. So, you will see sites where, there's not a whole lot of fact checking going on. And then you will see that there are sites that are very rigorously fact checked. And, obviously those, because the person really can't make up the stuff because somebody else is like going through it word by word and making sure everything's correct. So,
Yeah, it's
great
interesting. We were
novel.
laughing about this the other day. I used to work at a food magazine, which you wouldn't have thought that the fact checking would be as I was terrified of our fact checker. You would literally have an article, and of course, this is in the olden days, but you would have an article where you would actually have to go through and highlight every fact. And in the margin, you would have to write a source for that fact and not like, I got this out of this book. It would be, I got this out of this book on this page in this paragraph. Um, and it's very hard to know as media has sort of fragmented into a lot of smaller publications, which ones are still living up to those standards and which aren't.
Well, some of them now do put whether it's fact checked on, like, actually on the article, and they put the name of the fact checker, which is kind of nice too. So you you can
It adds that
split
element of
blame.
skin in the game that we were talking about.
So you can definitely blame someone if the facts are incorrect.
So, just to recap before we go on to the next point, I think what we've basically said here is when you're researching a subject, you need to find, and I guess I should say this, I don't believe in having one authority for anything, and I know you don't either.
Yeah,
So, what you're going to find is, depending on the size of the question, you're going to find at least a couple of sources that you feel have the authority, which means the background, the experience, the education, to talk about this subject and have the skin in the game that we were just talking about, where they are incentivized not to be inaccurate or misleading. And then the next layer on from that is that perhaps that source also has an infrastructure you trust for checking the facts, because we all have subjects we love and know and care about, and we still need people to catch us that we don't slide on something because it's easy for any of us to do. So you want to make sure that there's somebody who's not necessarily writing the story who's fact checking it. That independent source looking at things is really important.
absolutely.
So once you have a couple of sources, and this is something that I have always found helpful, is uh, I like to, and I don't think that this is unusual. I like to play my sources off against each other. So I will look at two experts and I will say, where do they agree and where do they disagree? And I have found, and let me know if you agree, the best sources shouldn't be 100% in line with each other. Like, I find that those moments of disagreement are where you know that they're thinking deeply about the subject at hand.
Absolutely. And it's always interesting to see where people disagree. And as I, earlier, a few years back, I was doing a lot of COVID coverage. Um, and so that was always interesting because, obviously the science was changing, the information was changing regularly, and there were very different opinions from, people who did have expertise. So trying to make sense, talk to numerous sources and try and figure out exactly how um, what is the most accurate information is
Yeah, I another reason, especially if you're going to on to interview the person, one of the things that I love to do is extrapolate some of the differences. And then I will tell you the truth, I started doing this in bridal magazine articles because we used to have to interview grooms. And grooms, for the most part, just desperately don't want to make the bride mad. You know, the bride had cared enough about this wedding to want it to be in a magazine. And so the grooms would be very hesitant sources, which I know people don't think about. They just didn't want to say the wrong thing. They didn't know if that flower was a dahlia or a Gerber or a daisy. They had no idea. So one of the things that I like to do when I was interviewing them is I would say, would you say that? And I would give them a quote. Would you? And it's not that I'm giving them the quote, it's that I'm giving them a springboard to build a statement from. So if I had two experts say on a medical topic, I might actually take a line out of the opposing person's source and say, so and so says washing your hands is good for you. Would you say that it's essential? And that tends to get an expert to start, you're giving them a framework for sharing something interesting, different, meaningful, nuanced that they might not have if you're just like, so tell me about washing your hands.
Right, right. And a lot of times too, if I did get very differing opinions from multiple sources, I would put both opinions in, into the story, like say, hey, this person says it's fine to do this, and this person says there are some, situations where it's not fine to do it. And then, sort of try and parse that out for people and give them both opinions so they can decide for themselves. So
And ultimately it does come down to that, right? Like you have a set of points of view, and we actually talked about doing this as a completely separate post, which is like, when is your research done? When do you know enough to make a decision? Because you're not writing about a subject if everybody knows it and everything is clear. You know, no one is writing a story that's like 4 facts that prove gravity makes things fall to the ground. Like nobody cares about that. So
right.
there's always going to be that element of you have to do the research and then make a decision. Um, when do you feel like you have enough information, just as a starting point for that conversation, which we might have more of later?
I think, again, I think it depends on, how important the topic is. For instance, you know, I mean, we talked a little bit about this, and this will be another episode, but, like, because sometimes it's so hard because there's so much information out there to like make a decision, and it's on dumb stuff like my curtains. That was my big thing. And I finally bought curtains. I still haven't put them up, but I bought them. And, but it took way too long. Like it should not have taken that many times through different stores or online shopping to decide on curtains. But obviously, right now we're deciding where my daughter may be going to college, so that requires a lot more research. Because it's a big decision, expensive decision, and 4 years of her life. So
Yeah, you know what's interesting is that also makes me think about the fact that there are different experts for different aspects of that
oh yeah.
question. So um, that's another thing to kind of keep your eye on, right? Because even an expert who has authority and specific knowledge and good research, are they actually answering the question that you came in wanting to know? It's so easy to get distracted by cool data
Right.
that it's adjacent to what you want to know, but it's not actually what you want to know. So I think that's another element of researching a topic is make sure that the facts that are sticking with you are the facts that you started researching wanting to know.
Right. And also, again, this is another subject where, with college, college research, where the experts may not all be, someone like we talked about, like where it's a doctor or skin in the game. You know, if you're wanting to know what the college campus life is like, you look at what students have to say, which, they're experts, but in a different sort of way.
100%. Of course, they have no skin in the game, so you have to take them with a several more grains of salt.
Well, and also you want someone who's maybe not a tour guide either. So you want the scoop from someone who just went there.
That's a good point too, right? It's authority, expertise, and no motivation to lie.
Right.
No
Because you
one
know
is
the
trying to
people who are
sell you.
giving the tour love the school.
Yeah, I guess by definition, it would be funny to have a disgruntled college tour guide.
That would be really hilarious actually, but no, we've always gotten people who love the school and tout its many
Yeah.
great so
So I think that we've covered everything that I thought I really wanted people to know. And again, the point of doing this was so that people will understand how we're doing the research that goes into any topic that we're covering on the podcast. So it's any, before we're bringing an expert in front of you, we are thinking about these things and we're showing you sort of what the next step would be. We've done this research. Now we're bringing you an expert and we're getting that expert's point of view. And I think our advice would always be to do a little of your own research when you're making these decisions too.
right, because I mean, in our write-ups, we also do include our own research. So, um, so it's not just whoever we talk to, like a financial planner or horticulturist or whoever we bring on, we think is the best one, that we can get to put on and talk about the topic. But you know, because we aren't offering 5 different opinions necessarily in the we only have so much time. So yeah, we will try in our write-ups to offer a little bit more information, that we have gotten from other sources as well, and offer the sources too. So you can read even further if you're really excited about a topic.
And we'll include a link to the resources, the write up underneath the episode. So people should be able to find things if they're interested in learning more.
In the Don't Panic Substack.
So if anybody has any questions about how we are thinking about these, or if there are questions you have about research that you want, ask them in the comments below. Thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yes, thank you. Bye.
Bye.